face are a catastrophic shift that threatens everything we love.
I noticed I had a double entry into Israel. On the one hand, I really got into Israeli society through the Mizrahi working classes. And I lived in a working class Mizrahi neighborhood where I still live today.
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. But also very involved in the left.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 25 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We begin with a trailer for the video Disruption. It's a call to arms to break up the road to hell that's been created by the fossil fuel companies. Then to a talk with Israeli activist Jeff Halper of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He talks about leaving Minnesota for Israel and many of the anti-occupation activists that he's met over the years. We close with a discussion of skunk and a happy video about the fate of one skunk truck.
All of the big social movements in history have had people in the streets.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
All of us must stand up together.
We will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
In our past, masses of people have taken the wheel of history and turned it. We have a responsibility to rise to our historical moment.
This is the singular issue of our time that will determine how we live, where we live, and if we live.
The scientific warnings keep intensifying, yet there has been no effective political response.
The tipping points that we face are a catastrophic shift that threatens everything we love, and it happens like that.
Each day of inaction, of business as usual, puts us closer and closer on this crash course.
Climate disruption is a social justice issue. Who gets hit first and worst? Every time.
What my country is going through as a result of this climate event is madness.
This is not just about the environment. It's about the community. It's about jobs. It's about justice.
This is not a green issue. This is an all of us issue.
This is going to have to be the fight of our lives.
It's communities of people coming together that will solve this.
The most fateful battle in human history, we will fight it together.
There is no replacement for human bodies standing as one, voices raised as one, making a political demand.
Jeff Halper has worked for decades against the Israeli practice of refusing to give Palestinians housing permits and then tearing down the homes of Palestinians built on their own land without the permit. Our talk is a look at the Israeli anti-occupation and anti-Zionist left. I'm speaking to Jeff Halper, who's from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's been on a tour of the Northeast, kind of finishing up with that now in New Haven. And we're not going to talk about house demolitions so much as just sort of the Israeli dissidents, the interesting people he's met over the ages. So when did you first get to Israel?
Well, I came to Israel first actually as a student in 1966. I was doing research. I'm an anthropologist. And at that time I was an undergraduate doing research on the Jews of Ethiopia, the Falashas. And as I was flying to Ethiopia, I stopped in Tel Aviv. And I stayed in a youth hostel with this old guy named Yosef. who took me to visit his family in Jerusalem. I remember standing in Abu Tor, looking in the lookout as you looked over the old city in those days. So I was there, and over the next few years, I was very involved with the left here, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
You're from Minnesota, right?
From northern Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Dylan's hometown.
Mm-hmm.
But more important, Gus Hall's hometown.
Really?
Yeah.
That I didn't know.
Yeah. So I was active, but as the 60s started to decline, we have to remember that at the height of the 60s, in 68, Nixon was elected. So not everybody was a 60s person. I began to become more and more alienated from this country. People kind of forget that part of the 60s was also a return to roots. Arthur Hailey's book, Roots, the African Americans going back to roots, and then you had Cesar Chavez and La Raza, and you had Vine Deloria and Russell Means and the American Indian movement, and I got very caught up in that. And in a sense, my Jewish identity became more important to me than my American identity. I just never felt a sense of kinship with Americans in particular. And not Jewish in a religious sense, I'm not religious. And Jewish in more of a cultural sense, I guess. Or maybe you might even say a national sense. In a way, I became an Israeli before I even went to Israel. It was part of that process where, if you were from a distinct ethnic or racial group, if you were black, if you were Chicano, if you were Native American, even if you're Asian, you could go back to roots. The white kids in the 60s, the WASP kids, didn't have roots to go back to. They owned the country. So they became hippies. Mm-hmm. And the hippies was that kind of a thing. You invented a culture. We call it a counterculture. And it had everything that a culture has. It had its own language, it had its dress, it had its neighborhoods, it had its foods, it had its traditions, its symbols. So that it was a very strong movement, even among the WASP middle-class white kids, to somehow reclaim something meaningful out of this American white
but you didn't get into that, you got into Israel.
But because I wasn't a WASP. I wasn't, I mean, I think there were very few blacks, for example, and maybe even Jews that were involved, that were hippies.
So when did you actually go to Israel to settle?
I went to Israel in 1973. I was a graduate student doing my field work in anthropology. In Jerusalem, I studied the working class Kurdish Jewish community. Wow. In Jerusalem, which is very interesting. But at the same, so that got me very involved with the Mizrahi Jews, the Jews that come from Muslim countries, who were pretty much the working class in Israel. And I worked for the municipality as a community worker in this neighborhood, inner city neighborhood in Jerusalem. And then at the same time, I made connections to the Israeli left, especially a group called Siach, a small HaYisraeli Hadash. In other words, the Israeli New Left. One of the people who's well known today, that headed it, was Reuven Kaminer. Reuven Kaminer is an old Marxist and still very active. Daphne Kaminer, his wife, is very important. She's one of the founders of Women in Black and Machzom Watch. His kids are important, his draft resistors and so on. But Gidon Eshet was a part of that, who became a very well-known economic journalist for the Israeli newspapers. Yossi Arnon, who was one of the founders of Peace Now. It was a very interesting group.
And this is after the war with Egypt, right?
This is before the war, in 73, before the war, that I started in the war.
I get it.
And I met my wife during in Siach as well, Shoshana. And we edited, one of the things we did is we edited a weekly newsletter, a digest of the Israeli news in English to begin to inform people. And that was kind of, so I know I had a double entry into Israel. On the one hand, I really got into Israeli society through the Mizrahi working classes. And I lived in a working class Mizrahi neighborhood where I still live today.
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. But also very involved in the left. So I was one of the few that kind of bridged those worlds, because people working, social workers, community workers, weren't necessarily on the left. They were focused on local issues. And the left was focused on the bigger issues and didn't have any common language really with working class people. So I was able to bridge that, and it's always been important to my work, because what we do in ICAD is insert a critical Israeli voice into the discussion. So the fact that I'm an activist, okay, that I go to the West Bank and so on, Gaza, fine. But I also know Israeli society very well from the inside. And I know the politics, and I know what people are thinking and their agendas. And that's really what makes my analysis way more relevant. It isn't simply my opinion about something, but I can really put myself in the shoes of Israelis and know where they're coming from and what their fears are and expectations and everything else, and then try to mold around that a kind of a political program.
Who are some of the other activists, leftists that you met over the years and maybe are not that well known in the States?
No, there's a lot, and they're not well known in the States. The one that I admire the most, and the one that I think is the most brilliant analyst on the left, although he's very controversial, is Michel Warshawski. He's also been a neighbor of mine for many years. And his wife, Leah Semel, is probably more well-known. She's a very well-known human rights lawyer. But Michel, or Mikado as he's known, was one of the leaders of Matzpen. And then in later years, beginning in the 1980s, founded what's called the Alternative Information Center. And his analysis is really excellent. He's a Trotskyist. He's still waiting for the Fourth Internationale to convene. But I think his analysis is very clear and he's really very good. And then there were other members of Matzpen. Matzpen was a very important group. I wasn't a member of it. It was really a Trotskyist organization, but very important in those days. Peretz Kidron was a part of it, who was a very famous journalist. Moshe Makover, who now lives in London. Akiva Or. I mean, some of the real important names, I think, in the early years, this is after the war in 1967, the very early years after the occupation began, and even before, were anti-Zionist. In other words, they were critical. Now, it's a no-brainer. I mean, even mainstream people have all the criticisms, and Zionism has become a kind of a passé term in many ways. But these were very early thinkers that very early on saw what was happening. Danny Amit was another. He was a physicist. He was a very important member of the left. He was our first
activity. The first thing we planned was a teach-in in 1982.
Right.
And somebody said, "Why don't you invite Dan Amit, a physicist?"
Right. And he became, because at that time, in the early 80s, we started the public committee for Birzeit, to support Birzeit University, that had been closed by the Israeli authorities for a long time. And that became, over the years, there's never been one organization now I'm talking about the critical left. I'm not talking about Peace Now, or Meretz, or became Meretz, or the Zionist left. I'm talking about, I don't necessarily say anti-Zionist, because some of them are post-Zionist, some are non-Zionist, some are Arabs or Palestinians, so it doesn't really make any sense anyway. I'm talking what I call the critical Israeli left, which means that it doesn't accept the idea, obviously, that Israel is or should be a Jewish state. It's Israeli. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that all these people on the left, including Mikado, served in the army. They always went to the army. In other words, they were Israelis. They didn't divorce themselves from Israeli life.
When you mention Arabs, though, what Arabs, Israeli citizens,
right,
did you work with? Because they didn't go in the army; they weren't allowed in, right?
No, they didn't go. They certainly didn't go into the army. No, that's true. I mean, but they also weren't really. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about in the critical left is much more of an internal Israeli Jewish group. You've always had certain Palestinian citizens of Israel involved in one way or another, but as a kind of a, you know, they had their own movements and their own organizations. There wasn't much of a crossover.
Overlap, yeah.
I mean, we knew each other. Eli Habibi and I mean, all kinds of people who were writers and so on. We worked with to some degree, but at the same time, they didn't get into the whole. Their concern, like today in some ways, was more of their trying to reclaim and trying to protect and trying to promote Palestinian national identity within Israel. You know, this is what led Azmi Bishara in the end towards the party Balad. The whole idea that Israel should recognize the Palestinians as a national minority, not simply as Israeli Arabs. So they had kind of their own agenda, and of course their own concerns. They were living under a military government until 1966. So what my involvement more was with the critical, I guess, Israeli Jewish left.
Did you know Israel Shachak?
I knew him very superficially. I didn't really know him very. I saw him around sometimes, and his work was really very, very important. He was more of a soloist, sort of. He wasn't really a member of different organizations.
He came to Connecticut a couple times.
Did he?
And spoke. He was really the first Israeli who I met, maybe in '83 or something, who was very, very critical of what was going on. Really opened up eyes.
You had Simcha Flappen, who edited a magazine called New Outlook. That was very critical, anti-Zionist, very critical. You know, when Ilan Pape published his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, about, what is it now, 7, 8, 9 years maybe, I asked him, you know, why hasn't this book been published before? I mean, it wasn't that new archives opened up and now he had material. He based a lot of his book on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, on Ben-Gurion's diaries, and on archival material that existed. It wasn't something, I said, why wasn't this book written 20 years ago, 50 years ago? And he said, you know, the material was all there, but only Israel Shachak and Simcha Flappen were brave enough to broach those subjects and wrote about it. But all the other, even the academic Zionist historians, you know, would never get into that. And so they've created a whole, I mean, you could be an academic, an intellectual even, a professor, and write all kinds of books on the Zionist movement, and somehow it's a little self-contained story in which the ethnic cleansing, all the elements that really kind of present Zionism as a settler colonial movement are missing. So it's not a matter of the information being there. So Shachak and Flappen were very important. Now I think the Matzpen people as well.
How about Dov Yermeya? Did you know him?
I didn't really know him. That was a little bit. No, I didn't know him.
I met him in New Haven. He wrote this, I think it was My War Diary. He was the oldest veteran in '82 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And then he was brought over here. And then, from what I know, he's still alive. He's got to be in his mid to late 90s. And he, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5 years ago, he returned something from the defense minister. He wanted to honor him. He said, I don't want to have anything to do with it.
No, there are figures like that, certainly, including ex-military figures. But he wasn't so involved in the movement. So that you had you had Matzpen, and then you had Uri Avneri, of course, was always a very important figure. He was the editor of Ha'olam Hazeh, which was the first This World, which is really the first really critical, iconoclastic magazine, kind of a yellow press magazine. So his idea was in order to get these critical views out to the public, he had to pander a little bit. So he had, for example, this is at a time in the 50s, when Israel was a very puritanical socialist society. It was the Beatles were not allowed to perform in Israel because they were seen as subversive. You didn't have parties and do rock dancing, or it was.
So what did Avneri do?
So Avneri had a centerfold with his newspaper of a naked woman in each, which was scandalous. But that's a lot of people bought the magazine for that. And he said, look, if that's what it takes to get the message out to the masses, I'll do it.
There's another guy in his 90s still writing.
And he's still in his 90s. He's writing. He's very active. And then Uri, of course, was in the Knesset. So he linked up with Meir Pa'il. Meir Pa'il was also another important figure, military fellow who still is alive. Not so active, but he's alive, a military historian. And they linked up with Shulamit Aloni, who was also, a very important human rights lawyer. And they created basically what's Meretz today. It went through different variations, Ha'olam Hazeh, and then Shelley and Moked, and there were different names of the party as it got bigger and smaller, and it finally merged with the Mapam party. But it's always been a Zionist. I mean, Uri Avneri is a Zionist. So he kind of bridges a little bit that the more radical Zionism, he's not anti, but the more critical Zionism and the mainstream Zionism. And that's the problem, of course, today with Meretz.
We've got to end up, but what about the anarchists nowadays? Are they, do you know some of them?
Yeah, no, the young people are very active. The anarchists against the wall, the Tayush people, the Sheikh Jarrah Solidarity people, work with Suwan. They're very active. But there's an intergenerational difference. And I guess I'm talking now a little bit as an old guy. And that is, in our day, the idea was you organize. Now, the left was always infected by pragmatism. When we organized, our groups were 5 people, 10 people, 15 people. We never had mass organizations. But today, the young people don't want to organize. They don't want to be boards. They don't want to be NGOs, certainly. They don't want to do analyses so much. They don't want to put out materials. They don't have a strategy. They want to be activists. And they'll say, we want the adrenaline to go. We want to go out every week and fight the army and then go home and get on with our lives. So it's not easy. They're very brave young people and very bright young people. But in a way, activism today, I think, has become a little bit ritualized even. I talk sometimes about the normalization of resistance. Like every Friday, if you're anarchist against the wall, you go to Bilin, you do Bilin, and then at 1 o'clock you're home. Every Saturday, if you're Tayush, you go down to the South Hebron Hills, you do something with the army, and then you come home. And there isn't it's not political in certain ways. And it's activisty. So, I think there's a real intergenerational change. And so today, the people of my generation, Mikado is kind of retired. He writes books. But he's still the chair of the Alternative Information Center. I still run ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Uri Avneri is the head of Gush Shalom, which is a movement of people in their 70s and 80s. But Uri's writing is wonderful. You've got other older people like Daphne Kamener, who's in Machzom Watch, Judy Blank, Ruthia Raz, and some others. Reuven is still, he's not so active anymore, but Reuven is still a voice on the left. So we're still there.
Well, I think at that point we're still there and we're
All
still
right.
kicking, so why don't we end it? I've been speaking to Jeff Halper. We've been talking about the left and the progressives inside of Israel. A few years ago, the Israeli government decided to spray people protesting their ever-growing apartheid wall with a noxious liquid. It soon became nicknamed skunk. Ali Abu Nima of the Electronic Intifada writes, "It's been described as smelling a chunk of rotting corpse from a stagnant sewer. Reportedly, any clothing that's sprayed has to be destroyed, and the odor sticks to a person for several days." Now, the Israelis are using skunk even in Jerusalem, at anything they feel like. This is a video taken in August by some youngsters with a cell phone. They worry that the skunk truck seems to be coming their way. It's hard to see the truck and its foul white stream, so we added a pink spot around an exclamation point to show you where to look. As you see, it's being sprayed around the neighborhood at nothing in particular.
نزلت عنا والله هي بتنزل. تاني مسكرين شبابيك الدار.
الحين كنت في الحمام أنا سكرتها لكن عبرت علينا ريحة وإحنا بنعرف إيش.
الله يعني صدقني زح برش عليها.
حرام صدقني صح.
Then something remarkable. The truck falls into a ravine, much to the delight of the children. Skunk, another disgusting toy of the self-described most moral army in the world, paid for by the exceptional American people. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller. This is The Struggle.